Esta es Colombia, una tierra con una belleza tan inmensa que te espera para ser vivida. La gran biodiversidad que habita en nuestros paisajes, lugares llenos de historia, tradición y gente bella. Los sabores y la riqueza mística de nuestras tierras, las miradas, las lenguas y esta gran cultura que enmarca nuestra identidad. Te invito a redescubrir eso que nos hace únicos en el mundo. Colombia, el país de la belleza.
Y media. Estamos aquí hablando varios, perdón que no es salud.
We're here.
Buenas tardes a todas y todos.
Good afternoon, everyone.
For what promises to be a tremendous conversation. Pero antes de empezar,
But before we begin, at some advertising. Tonight, Mariana Mazzucato is going to be at 7:30 p.m. at Theater Adolfo Mejia, speaking with you about two of her last books. One I am very fond of because Mariana bears one of the most profitable industries of our time, consulting industry. But it is very important to open up a public debate on this. It's not that people with knowledge are not necessary, but you can't mutilate a company's needs and the state's needs of doing things. All right.
we want to understand how we can live better if we don't research and reflect on the reasons of the crisis in our personal way of life. What undermines so strongly our lives that divided our communities and takes away our dreams for a better life? What is your opinion about this?
I was busy. My headphones don't work, so I was fussing with them. Can you just, what is our dream of a better life?
Okay.
Oh my gosh. And what couldn't be changed?
And what undermines these dreams now? Mm-hmm.
Something I was thinking about, an environmentalist friend of mine likes to talk about the tyranny of the quantifiable. We live under capitalism, commercialism, etc., that convinces us we want money, we want material goods, and of course everybody wants security, but conversations that make it hard to value and doesn't always give us the language for these other things, for hope, for community, for meaningful work, meaningful lives, purposefulness, etc. And so as a writer, I've often tried to look at these things that are less tangible, less quantifiable, the things money can't buy, that don't get produced in factories, and try and articulate the necessity, the value, the possibilities of that. So among the 10,000 things I would think of would be more language for valuing those things that are not commodities or commodifiable, that are not possessions but relationships.
Okay.
Can I take issue with the question? So at least in my experience, I don't think people have stopped dreaming. I think there's a real sense of impatience and urgency, for example, amongst our young global teenagers. You might remember that just before COVID, there was globally a movement called Fridays for the Future, which began with Greta Thunberg, but actually it became a global movement where young people basically told the older generation, you've screwed up. You know, our generation has no hope because of how you failed to make certain decisions and have certain actions. So they're impatient for a better world. That doesn't mean they've stopped dreaming. And at least in my world, I'm an economist, sorry, I always remind people that there's different ways of doing capitalism. So Rebecca, I think everything you said is completely right, but the danger sometimes of putting it that way is it makes it look like, oh, the market system is hugely problematic. We all have somehow been brainwashed into buying stuff. But actually, there's different way even to structure the so-called market. The market is nothing that's like, it's not like the boogeyman that's out there imposing bad conditions. It's a result. The market is a result, an outcome of how we choose, again, agency, how we choose to structure companies, which globally have been badly managed. $7 trillion, that's 12 zeros, have been used just to buy back shares in the market, to boost stock prices, stock options, executive pay. So we have a structure of companies that's just wed to shareholder value. How we choose to structure the public sector, which I believe is by design reactive, by design always in patching up, fixing mode. How we choose to structure civil society organizations like trade unions, which are incredibly important, and how we choose to make them interact. And I'll shut up, otherwise I will talk too much, but if we care about the world, if we care about people, we will care about governance structures and how to make these different actors work well together to solve the biggest problems of our time around health, pandemics, around climate, around biodiversity, around water, around the fact that so many young people don't feel valued anymore. So crime is often a result of when your own life has no meaning, so someone else's life has no meaning. So an outcomes-oriented economy, and that's not what we have right now.
Okay, Tsitsi.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Tsitsi Dangarembga.
Gracias. Yo vengo de Zimbabue, que queda ubicado en el sur de África. Soy novelista.
And I write non-fiction occasionally. So this is a really interesting question for me, coming from my part of the world, where we have about 7 countries in the southern part of Africa that went through liberation struggles against colonizing governments. And all of these governments have been a disappointment to the people. And so if you ask someone coming from my part of the world, what prevents us from realizing our dreams and living well together, the answer is leadership. And so, of course, we are talking about the leadership in our countries now. But that leadership in our countries now is a result of reaction to colonizing forces. So we can also include the whole colonizing enterprise in leadership. And this is where it becomes interesting, because the whole colonizing enterprise was a capitalist enterprise. It was in the interests of capitalism and private property and accumulation. In fact, Zimbabwe is the only country in the world that began as a private company. It was a private company called the British South Africa Chartered Company, which was given a royal charter by by the Queen of England, Queen Victoria at that time, to go into this land between the Limpopo River in the south and the Zambezi in the north and claim it. So even the fact that we have private armies today is something that came out of colonization as well, because when Cecil Rhodes went up with his company, he also had a private army that was armed with rifles and guns. There was about 500 of them, and they were really just a conglomeration of all sorts of odd bodies who didn't have anything better to do in southern Africa, who had left the northwest of the world. And the atrocities that they meted out and practiced upon the people in my part of the world are really beyond understanding. And so no good government can come out of that kind of system. I would agree with you, Mariana, that there are different ways of practicing capitalism, but I think the very notion of private property is dangerous because it wakens the desire to possess in us. And the desire to possess is difficult to stop once it has been awakened. And so I think that when you talk about good governance, it is the national leadership, it is the regional leadership, it is the world leadership that for me is problematic. And I do also think that the youth is one reservoir of new ideas because they are facing a world that we older people did not have to face when we were growing up. We are the ones who have left a world that has made our own children so anxious because of our desire for accumulation and taking things out of the world, out of the earth, to build wonderful places like this. We have left our children a world where they do not even know whether they will live to 50.
Mauricio.
Yo tengo dificultades para hacer.
It's not easy to predict the future. I'm afraid my crystal ball is a bit foggy. I prefer looking or striving to understand. So I'd say the following. And the starting point would be the cognitive revolution that began with Edward Wilson in the 70s. As human beings, more than rational beings, we are emotional beings with imagination. And it's imagination is what most helps us and what most harms us. It's a double-edged sword. I believe what we need to do is return to this idea of the Greeks, which is know yourself, knowing ourselves. I believe this plays a very important role in resolving today's problems. And the challenge we face is that the Homo sapien brain is a brain from the days of the hunters and gatherers from 30,000 years ago. Our brain has not been designed for mobile phones or for TVs or conversations such as these. Our brain evolved up until that stage. This might be debated, but in general terms, our brain has been designed for that stage. That's why, for example, we really like sugar, because at that point in time, it was very difficult to come by sugar. So our brain is designed to access and capture as much sugar as possible. But since today we have an excessive abundance of sugar, we consume all the sugar we can because we're convinced that's what our body needs. So we have this brain from 30,000 years ago, and we have these institutions that are from 3 centuries ago, the ones that came about in the 18th century. And the truth is that imagination and creativity in the institutions that we have has advanced relatively little. And we have technology from the 21st century that is too much for us. So we don't know what to do with our mobile phone addiction, with social media. There is a disconnect between our brains, the institutions we have, and the technology present and the interconnectedness of our world. Human beings cooperate through imagination. It's the stories that we invent, religions, stories of our homeland, etc., that allow us to cooperate and collaborate. And Harari says the following: elephants can cooperate amongst 100, 120 individuals. We can cooperate between thousands and millions, but it's not very easy to cooperate beyond 500 million. We haven't developed a fantastic story that allows us to cooperate among the entire population. What allows us to cooperate is the market.
About the moon, I love the idea that you developed in the book. Pero creo que el mercado también ha perdido alma y ha perdido.
But I believe we've lost our imagination, and we've lost for example, democracies have become very electoral and they've lost their soul and spirit. What we need to do is find a way to breach that gap, that distance between these three things. And to do so, we need to recover our soul, our spirit, and our storytelling. The market is not enough. Our consumer society is not enough. And that is what concerns me. How can we tell stories that promote cooperation, that improve cooperation, and not that accentuate this dangerous dispersion, and also ones that can allow us to adapt our institutions because they are very weak?
In Colombia, we are celebrating the centenary of one of the most important novels in our literature and in the global south too, La Vorágine, or the Vortex. The author, José Eustacio Rivera, explored the brutal impact of the second industrialization through the exploitation of rubber in the lives of hundreds of thousands of the Aboriginal people in the Amazonas. Actually, this is one of the first genocides in the history of the last century. In our country alone, the barons who exported rubber with their London partners to the British market exterminated 80% of population of our part of the Amazonas. Is the capitalism the principal agent of the disintegration of the best values of our world? Sit. Sit.
Well, you were talking about imagination, Mauricio, so I think I'm using my imagination here. But I'm going to hazard to say that I do think that capitalism has potential genocidal tendencies. I think we have seen this throughout history. We can go back before this event that you were talking about to, for example, slavery. And I'm talking here about the transatlantic slavery. Again, that was a genocidal enterprise. People think about the enslaved people who were captured and taken across the Atlantic to the Americas. They do not think about the people who were left behind. The people who were captured were the men mainly, and the strong men, the able-bodied men, the young men, who are the backbone of any pre-modern society. It was an agrarian community, which meant lots of hard physical work. So taking all of these people away meant that you were depriving the society of its means of supporting itself. And so that is a genocidal activity. It was also the beginning of a specific kind of patriarchy that was very brutal towards women, because it meant that women were left with this added burden that arose when the men were taken away. So I do think that, in fact, capitalism and genocide are twins. I do believe that it does not have to be so. I firmly believe that there are ways of practicing capitalism that do not have to be genocidal. But the way the world has been led from the time of these industrial revolutions has released the worst of us rather than the best of us. And I think that is where it comes back to leadership. In fact, I do believe in democracy as a system as well. But here's the catch. What kind of person stands up and says, I am the best person to lead you? In other words, that person is saying, you are not as good as I am because you need to be led by me. I am the one who has the capacity to lead you. So there's an inherent contradiction there. And I think it's very difficult to have the necessary conversations because there is always something going on in the world that stops us having honest conversations about what is on the ground. At the moment, it's Gaza. So there are some things you can say about that situation depending on where you are, and other things that you cannot say about that situation. It stops us from having these honest conversations. So I do believe that the realm of the imaginary, in fact, is extremely important. This book you are talking about that has given rise to my having this response is a work of imagination. It's a creative work. And I was having this discussion with Mariana before we came in about the role of creative enterprise in creating a more open society.
I think one of the reasons I have a hard time just with these big words like capitalism is that I've chosen to work with leaders, and there's different types of leaders, some lead, some don't, but that are actually getting their hands dirty and in the process are also under attack. Yvonne Sawyer, the mayor of Freetown in Sierra Leone, Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, Georgia Gould, the leader of my council in London, of Camden Council, Ada Colau, who is the mayor of Barcelona, Claudia Lopez, the mayor of Bogota. And by the way, these were all women, not by chance. They're all actually leading. And my experience with these leaders, and again, leadership definitely matters, is that they didn't just stop at saying public versus private, global north, global south. You know, all those problems do exist. Mia Mottley, by the way, the Prime Minister of Barbados, is constantly talking about that because the Bretton Woods system, in other words, the structure of the United Nations and the power structures within that, the structure of the World Bank, the structure of the IMF is completely outdated. The voices at the table are not from the Global South, and she talks about the double jeopardy, in other words, how the Global South have been screwed over twice, that the problems that they are facing from climate were not caused by the Global South, it was caused by how the Global North developed, and then the financial system and the fiscal space that's required to combat, to tackle those problems is not there because of how the international financial architecture has been structured by the Global North. So it's not that these women leaders are naive. They know the deep problematic structures of the global capitalist system, the global financial system. But if they just sat around saying, oh, it all sucks, finance sucks, capitalism is crap, the private sector just doesn't care, they shouldn't get out of bed. But they do get out of bed. And they get out of bed with courage. They get out of bed provoking and trying to make change. So again, Mia Motley says if we are going to have the most sustainable small island state, or let's call it a large ocean state, if you look at the huge ocean around Barbados, it means changing how the hotels in the tourism industry works. They have to be less extractive, yeah? They need to be investing within the workers who work in those hotels instead of just making the profits and putting it out in some sort of tax haven. And she even tried to structure something called the BEST program, the Barbados Employment it was a recovery program, which said that during COVID, because the hotels didn't have tourists inside, there was a moment to have a social compact with the hotels to make sure that they took the time, because there was no tourists, to render more green everything that the hotels were doing, right? Every sector in the country should make those changes. But they didn't. They refused, right? So actually putting the social contract at the center, the deal, the Green Deal, what is the deal, means actually coming to the table and negotiating a different way ahead. In the US, by the way, they're putting all this money into the system, close to $5 trillion in their IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, if you look at all the different pieces of that. And sometimes there's courage, sometimes there isn't. So the CHIPS Act, which is related to it but different, is $400 billion that's being given to semiconductor companies so that the US can become sovereign in terms of chips production. But that's just a giveaway. That's not a solution. You're just going to give money out to the semiconductor industry. What they did, and I worked with Gina Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce, another woman, was to say, hold on, you have a moment where you can change the deal with the semiconductor companies. Instead of just giving them subsidies and guarantees, make sure that as part of that deal, they treat workers better, they pay them the living wage, they improve working conditions, they reinvest profits back into production instead of just to the shareholders. They use energy efficient supply chains in semiconductors, and that's the deal right now. Or during COVID, the French finance minister said, instead of just giving money to the airlines because they weren't flying, we're going to give them money conditional on them committing to reducing their carbon emissions in the next 5 years. And they had to if they wanted the COVID bailout. Whereas in the UK, we gave $600 million to EasyJet, one of our airlines, no conditions attached. So this heterogeneity of how to do the deals, how to do capitalism, needs to surface. Otherwise, it's too easy to say, you know, private property is bad. Okay, but what are you going to do with that? And I might agree with what private property has done to all the different things that you've all said, which I agree with, but then how do we actually change every single contract, including intellectual property rights, when we're making vaccines during COVID, which means that those property rights need to be weaker, we need to share the knowledge, we need to join the patent pool so that African countries can produce their own vaccines instead of relying on some sort of philanthropic will of the global north to send expired vaccines to Africa and to have what ended up being vaccine nationalism.
Okay.
Sí.
Rebecca.
What comes to mind when you talk about genocide and the rubber industry, I think of the Belgian Congo as well as the Putumayo, the Amazon, etc., is how easy it is for us all to consume commodities whose origin we don't know. And it goes back to what you said, and we used to live in worlds where most of what we owned, we used, we made, we knew the animals or the plants it came from or the people who made it. We have never really adapted to a world where almost everything we own, use, consume comes over, as though it comes from over the horizon, from a place we don't see, from labor we don't see, from impacts we don't see. And the rubber industry was really interesting because it was where some of the early human rights movements around colonial genocide, colonial labor happened. One of my personal heroes is Roger Casement, who was a British government official who in both the Congo and the Putumayo rainforest saw and exposed the genocide, the inhuman conditions, etc., and had to resign from the British government. Ultimately became an Irish nationalist because he learned from colonialism in Africa and South America, that Ireland was also a colony, and so he was part of the Easter Rising and was executed. But it's happening now. My most recent book is called Orwell's Roses, because I became fascinated with the fact that in between fighting fascism and totalitarianism, Orwell was such a passionate gardener, and what that illuminated. So I wrote a book about both Orwell and roses. And something I'd been fascinated with, I came here in 2019 to look at, is the rose industry. And we still live in that world. You can go to a supermarket almost anywhere in the United States, and the roses you buy will have been grown around Bogota. They will have flown 1.6 million at a time in a windowless 747 jet to Miami to be put in refrigerated trucks to be distributed. And the environmental and labor conditions in which these roses are grown in this country are horrific. I don't think 1% of Americans thinks about them. And there's this kind of fascinating disconnect, particularly for me, with roses, because they're supposed to be about love, about beauty, about nature, and yet they're produced in these conditions that are in so many ways antithetical to these things. And so I think on the one hand that there's a way that, and to contradict what I said the first time, there's a kind of abstraction of the things we own. We don't see who made our phone, who grew our flowers, the fact that we're surrounded by plastic that comes from fossil fuel and all the harms that that does. And I'm fascinated also that human rights movements and environmental movements going back to the Belgian Congo and the Putumayo, a lot of the work we do is images and stories to make people have relationships again to these things, to who made them, to where they were made, to what it did to nature, to what it did to humanity. And so I find that process fascinating, of trying to reconnect what has been disconnected, to build back the relationships that are broken when we buy things without knowing who made them, what they're made out of, where they were made, what the cost of making them was. So that process has long fascinated me as a writer and an activist. And thank you.
Mauricio.
Sí, yo quisiera.
All right, I'd like to ask, or rather respond to Mariana. It is true that saying that capitalism is soulless, is insufficient, or that companies just seek their own benefit, and that the world is dominated by corporations. If we only say that, we can't really get out of bed to work. That is true. That perspective must be avoided, but we must also avoid the other perspective, this other one that offers this statement of greed is good, that the only thing that actually moves and drives the world is greed, and that greed is the element not only that actually motivates us to get out of bed and leave our homes and go to work, but rather that which drives equality and the best virtues, the best public virtues. Greed is perhaps morally what we need. I believe that that speech, which has, I think, been lowered in the last decades, and that has been attenuated in the last decades, but however, it was present for so many decades, and it was the predominant moral in the world. I believe we must also avoid it. And I do believe that this has a lot to do with human nature. All human beings, we have these angels and devils inside of us. So what have we created since the Greeks, since the ancient Greeks, to avoid demons to take over us and for sad emotions that I actually spoke about yesterday to take over people? What have we created? What have we invented? And what has humanity, once again, since the ancient Greek, and I once again talk about the metaphor of Ulysses being chained when he crosses through that gap where the sirens are and where the mermaids are, and he asks the pirates to cover their ears, and the vessel goes or reaches the shore and the mermaids go there. Well, Ulysses invented for him to be chained
to listen to mermaids without him being able to do anything. Those are what institutions are today, and that is exactly what we must create to find that good midpoint, that middle ground between greed, on the one hand, as a moral rule, and totalitarianism, or this idea that the only way of saving ourselves is the state or the tyrant. And that is what institutions are. And what concerns me the most is that these institutions are every day weaker. We are facing global problems such as migrations, AI, wars, and global warming. These problems have no borders. These are absolutely affecting all countries. And despite this, we have local institutions, even parochial ones, to solve those problems that are borderless. So what I said at the beginning was, we have institutions that have not been adapted or adjusted to solve those types of problems. And of course, to create adequate institutions, we first need to create a narrative, a speech, an imagination, a story that allows us to create those institutions.
In Greek, and I have no expertise in this, but the word idiot, idiota, means someone who has no sense of the public, of the collective. So someone who's just about the private.
Yes, idiotes.
Yeah,
idiotes.
and hence greed is an idiot. But then the question is the sense of purpose, the sense of the common good, which ultimately we're all speaking about. I think from an economics point of view, my sense is, for example, in economic theory, there's no theory of the common good. This is why this book I'm writing now on the political economy of the common good will take me many years, because we have a notion of the public good, el bien público, but in economics, the public good is a correction for something the private sector is not doing due to a market failure. So again, we have this notion that there's capitalism, markets work very well due to all the maximization of profits by companies, maximization of utility, so well-being by consumers. Even workers are assumed to be maximizing their trade-offs of leisure versus work. This is the theory, which is kind of bullshit. But anyway, and then they say, but sometimes the market fails. And that's when the public sector needs to come in to correct for a market failure, either by preventing a bad through a carbon tax, or doing a good through investing in clean water, so on and so forth. So in my view as an economist, we have to get rid of that. We need to understand, what are we trying to do? Where do we want to go? We have the Sustainable Development Goals, 17, right? The UN Sustainable Development Goals, which didn't come from us. The world signed up to them. What does it mean to structure an economy and a society in a serious way that goes after them? No hunger, no poverty, gender parity, but it's a system. So you might actually achieve one, for example, around climate change, which is SDG 13, but if you do it by just thinking you can electrify, right, your society with electric vehicles, where do you think the batteries come from, right? The lithium used for those batteries is exactly the dynamic you've been describing in terms of an extractive capitalism. Lithium, when it's extracted, is killing our waterways. It's polluting. And also the people extracting it are not being treated well, as you say. So we need to have a systemic way even to go after those goals. But to do that, we need, I think, what you've been insinuating, collective intelligence. We need lots of different people. And you say it's too hard when you have millions. You said that before. Maybe, but I don't know. I know that to get to the moon, we had 400,000 people involved. Every single industry. It wasn't just aerospace. It was nutrition, materials, electronics. You had a strong guidance by the public sector, NASA, but lots of different companies. But NASA wasn't stupid. They said, you don't just come in the private sector and help us in space. You will have a strong direction. We will have contracts that are outcomes-oriented. They used outcomes-oriented procurement. Las compras públicas, no, was done through an outcomes orientation. They had to solve 1,000 homework problems. The solutions got us camera phones, foil blankets, baby formula, software, but we don't do any of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, that way. There's no urgency, there's no clear direction, there's no clear contracts, By the way, the NASA contract said no excess profits, no gambling, no rents. We're going to do this together. You're not going to make billions on the back of public money. We're going to solve problems. You will make profits, but not excess profits, excess rents. So I personally think that when we care about things, look at what happens with wars. People care about war. They want to win the war. They make money. They make money when we have wars. Germany, overnight, created 190 billion euros after saying there was no money for other things, no? When we go to war, no one says, oh shit, there's no tax revenue. We need to wait. Sorry, we'll go to war in 6 months. We need to first collect the tax. We make money to fight in Afghanistan, World War II, Vietnam. We don't make money for the social problems. We don't organize grants, loans, subsidies, procurement in an outcomes-oriented way like we do when we go to war. So this is why I always go back to agency. There's decisions, stupid decisions, bad decisions, criminal decisions that we make when we don't treat our social problems as urgently as, unfortunately, we treat wars. And we need to own up to it and show we know how to do things better. We've simply decided not to.
Sí,
If I could, I would.
Sorry, Mauricio.
hay que acabar la guerra también.
Mauricio, Tsitsi está pidiendo la
I'd like
palabra.
to say,
Mauricia, Tsitsi is wanting to talk.
I would like to say that I find this conversation really interesting because I am sitting here as a person from the Global South, an indigenous person from the Global South. And I am sitting in a context where I am with people from the Global North, or I am with people who are not indigenes of the Global South on the whole. And my thinking is that the Global North refuses, as you say, to be aware of the origin of its own problems, which is itself. So, if the Global North is the creator of the problems we have in the world today, which in fact it is today, currently, as we see it, because every society in this world, every nation in this world is plugged into the economic system that was created by the Global North, that was predicated on these acts of genocide and extraction. So we cannot wish them away. The poverty in the nations of the Global North was outsourced to the rest of the world by the big nations of the age of exploration, Spain, Portugal, then came France and England and so forth. And so I do not think that the Global North is capable of solving the problems. Because how can you solve the problem that you created without understanding that you have to undo the basics and reconstruct them in a different way? I don't think this is going to happen because those people who are benefiting from extraction are so incredibly powerful. Those are the people who go to war in a minute but refuse to engage with these social problems because you don't need to at the moment. I think that there will come a time, because what I have seen is that what is enacted by the Global North on other parts of the world does slowly migrate back to the Global North. And so slowly we are going to see that the Global North also has to engage with some of the problems, many of the problems that were imposed on the Global South. And I think at that moment is the moment when maybe these structures will start to reform.
And related to this, in the United States, in the last 20 years, more than 1 million people, principally white men, died from overdose. An authentic tragedy. But, in my opinion, this is a massive suicide of a part of the US male population. Is the crisis of our world only a failure of white civilization, or is a crisis of the entire world? Sorry.
A crisis of the US or of the world? What?
About.
I'm-
Okay.
There's so many moving parts to that, and I could add to that, everybody in the US, or, okay, not everybody, but we talk about the gun problem a lot in the US, and we talk about murder with guns. Actually, the majority of deaths by gun in the United States are suicides. About 66% are suicides. I'm fascinated by the idea that men buy guns, because it's mostly men, mostly white men, because it makes them safer and more powerful. They're going to kill the bad man who threatens them, but they don't know that the bad man who threatens them is themselves. And so, there's been a lot of drug overdoses, and again, we have to go back to predatory capitalism. The Purdue Pharmaceuticals created a deeply addictive product and then spent a fortune, OxyContin, and spent a lot of money convincing doctors it wasn't addictive, that everybody needed it after every surgery and trouble. They created mass addiction and mass death. But there's also what gets called deaths of despair. And some of them are working class people in a country where a working class man used to be able to support a family, own a home, buy a car, live a fairly, maybe work for one company for his whole life and be pretty secure. And now nobody works for anything for their whole life. There's no security. People at the lower end of the economy don't make enough to live on. People live in tremendous debt and precariousness. So I think there's so many things at work. There's since Ronald Reagan, we rearranged the economy to create desperation and poverty where there used to be stability and security. But there's also a crisis. I totally agree, there's a crisis of a certain kind of white man. There's a white Protestant man in particular who really expected he would be the dominant species in the United States, that the government would be Protestant white men, that the institutions would be run by Protestant white men. And a number of them, fed by right-wing fear-mongering and hate, find a world in which people of color and women are increasingly equal, not fully equal, not nearly fully equal, but more equal than we used to be, terrifying and upsetting. And if you think the whole cake is yours, anybody else getting a slice of cake makes you feel poor, even if you have plenty of cake for yourself, seems to be what it is. And so that's a factor too. And so there's so many things going on, but it's also, in the same way Purdue Pharmaceutical manipulated people to become addicted, the right wing, and you can see this in Hungary, you can see this in Russia, you can see this in parts of Britain, also manipulate us. A sense of scarcity. There's not enough for everybody. If those people get anything, they took it from you. You deserve more than them, which is also very much a colonial attitude, of course, an attitude that, bolsters white supremacy in so many ways. So I think you have to look at all the factors at work: patriarchy, masculinity, right-wing propaganda, corporate propaganda, because guns, just like drugs, are sold essentially by cartels that know they are profiting off mass death and choose to make that profit.
Thank you.
I mean, again, it's interesting how we're kind of going in circles, and all these bits are true, but then the question is, what's the kind of solution, huh? And I've been really struck how the progressive, let's say left, I don't like to talk about left and right, but ultimately when we go to elections, there's often, a center, a left, and a right. But on the left, there's been very little, and I see this today in the UK, where the Labour Party is hoping to win. They are supposed to win statistically if you look at the polls, but they might not win if you don't have a narrative, a story about the source of the problems, right? So we can look at the global dimension, and Tsitsi, you're absolutely right. This is why Mia Mottley, again, the Prime Minister of Barbados, talks about the so-called Bridgetown Initiative, that it's not about patching things up. We need completely new voices at the table, global South voices at the table, not just someone else's table, restructuring, changing what that table even is, right? So again, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN system, having serious problems that need to be deconstructed and reconstructed, she says. But these companies like Purdue Pharma or Purdue, which have a national effect in the US, these are global companies, so you could look again at what they've done globally, different companies like that in terms of this colonized form of capitalism. But ultimately, when we go to the electoral box, and there's lots of elections happening this year that's coming, and people don't hear a different story, a different narrative of how to create value differently, then ultimately what we have is that some talk about poverty, exploitation, problems about care, why we need to invest in schools and hospitals, and others who talk about wealth creation, innovation, industrial strategy, electrification, artificial intelligence. And these are two totally different worlds. And I think ultimately what we need is these kind of multidisciplinary discussions that we have here, which are really important, about how do we actually create a different economy, a different society, and as an economist, value differently. How do we create wealth differently instead of it just being redistributing wealth and value that was created so problematically through all the different evidence that we've just heard. And as I mentioned before, lithium and all the new resources that are being used to create a greener economy are just as bad in terms of how they are being extracted from the ground, how the labor is being treated globally, and in this part of the world, is where a lot of these resources are coming from. But if we don't actually have hope that we can create and co-create value differently, then nothing is going to change. And I do think, I often say this, that the left has been very good at talking about redistribution, very bad at talking about creation. And what we need is to create it, for all the reasons that Tsitsi says, in a radically different way, instead of just patching up the problems ex post with some of the symptoms of the disease. So I really value these panels, but the problem is that this then just becomes a nice talk unless we really put the discussions at the center of how to build a different economy.
Well, what I think is that when you say value as an economist, you mean money, basically. Okay, good. So that's really important, because most people think of money when they talk about value, when they talk about wealth. So I think the narrative should be around redefining value. And some countries have done that. Costa Rica, for example, Bhutan, for example. And this is based on work that began, I think, in India with Professor Sen about social goods and social bads. So I think that really is one of the starting points. And I think this goes back to something that Mauricio talked about in the beginning, when he mentioned the ancient Greeks. And what was your sentence again?
About Ulysses?
About the idea about what it was to be human, to know yourself. It was important to know yourself.
The Greek idea of conoscete.
Know yourself.
That is such an important point that you have brought up, because the break in the kind of philosophy behind the society of the ancient Greeks came with the Romans. And we have not broken that model ever since. And so this is why I think that it will be very difficult for the global north to break that, because they are still trapped in this trajectory of history that began with Roman colonization of the rest of Europe, and that led to, well, the Romans pulled out of England, which is probably why the English did not have to have an engagement with the Romans, and just thought that they had developed naturally from the state that they were in when the Romans found them, which was really a state of lack of civilization of any nature. So they probably think it is within their nature, their natural progression, that they came to be civilized. But actually it was through conquest, and that is not being owned up to. So I think that until the global north can look at philosophies and ways of doing things that come from other societies that are not part of the global north and value those equally, so that we can take from those what is best, what is going to contribute to the well-being of the people on the planet and the well-being of the planet. So this also suggests a new relationship between people and planet, because human beings, through these white men that you talk about, have put themselves above the animals. Where I come from, just like 2 generations ago, if a person had to kill an animal to have something to eat, they would apologize to the animal. Say, I'm sorry, but I have to do this in order to live. So these are some of the things that I think that the global north is not capable of understanding on its own.
Mauricio, para cerrar.
Sí,
Mauricio, in closing. Mariana, I agree in that there is a political division that is no good, where the left criticizes and the right must innovate. Anywho, we're a bit stuck there. I feel we need a lot more innovation for the left. And we need to work harder to create a different world, a world of cooperation.
I love the way you've ignored everything I've said, but go ahead.
pero pensando en eso justamente,
But with this in mind, I feel it's not enough for the right to merely promote innovation and to even promote creativity and imagination. Even when referring to the private and public sector, it doesn't work when the rules don't work. For example, the issue of war. How can this be resolved when we have a Security Council that's completely anachronic? The Security Council is a system that not only does not work to promote peace in the world, but it also promotes war. The veto power makes it impossible for world powers to understand each other. Therefore, the Security Council and the UN itself has become a rhetorical forum where they are incapable of resolving conflicts in the world. Therefore, wars promote great injustices and pain in the world. And if there is no institution and rules to end this, then we are stuck and we will not be able to progress. Or perhaps the only way to escape the situation, and here a book by Rebecca comes to mind, is by means of a tragedy. And perhaps we need a tragedy like my mom said. I hope that's not the case. God forbid that it require a war to help us feel more compassion and a sense of humanity to be able to create a world for cooperation and to be able to create international institution. Can we go?
Important thing, how we value what we value, and if it's just money, if we confuse price with value, which is what we do, if you marry your babysitter, GDP goes down. That's how stupid it is, how we value. If you pollute, GDP goes up, because you just have to pay someone to do it. What you're talking about is central, but no one understands it. That's why people ignore it.
Okay.
So when those 4 kids got lost in Colombia, in the jungle, in the Amazon, they had indigenous knowledge. That's why they survived. The big water crisis we have, where the global hydrological cycle is at risk, the knowledge, the indigenous communities globally have always valued water. Water is life. They have ways, as you say, you said, thanking an animal when it's killed. If you look at indigenous knowledge on water, we then from the global north have all our, water solutions. Ultimately, we're not respecting, we're not valuing an old knowledge about water, which is critical to actually facing this global hydrological cycle. So I'll just stop by saying, what you said about value is central, and if people don't listen, we will not solve any of the global challenges we have, and the SDGs will just be blah, blah, blah.
Okay. It's resolves that tremendous panel. Thank you so much. If there are any questions, our guests would be happy to answer them. Thank you so much. It's a tremendous panel. ¿Preguntas? No alcanzo a ver.
¿Hola? Acá. Acá. Sí.
No veo.
En español o en inglés, ¿cierto?
Ah, listo. Allá.
Okay, yeah, you talked about something really important, and is that, well, I'm gonna sit down, sorry. And is that if we want to address to the social problems we have to look at the very same structures of the world we live in, so we can address them looking at these very same problems. But when we think about things such as poverty or precarious labor or even addiction, these same social problems seems to be very profitable, for example, for the powerful people on the global north and even the pharmaceutics. So can we really think of changing the structures of the systems we live in when these very same systems seems to be oriented, or the goal of these very same systems seems to be to maintain and create these very same social problems that we're trying to address?
Tsitsi.
Well, I think that this is something that has more or less been touched on the panel. And one thing I wanted to say is that in South Africa, towards the end of apartheid, there was a crisis of suicides in the Afrikaner society. The white men, white Protestant men in South Africa, as they saw the end of their sovereignty coming, could not bear it, and they engaged in these suicides. And quite often they would kill their own family, the whole family, before they turned whatever the weapon was on themselves. So we are looking at a system that people are willing to die for. We are looking at a system where I like to use the words melanated and lesser melanated. So white men for me would be lesser melanated men. We are looking at a system where lesser melanated men are willing to see other lesser melanated men of a lower class dying by means of overdoses or guns or whatever it may be in order to retain their power. And so I think that we really need to define where the power is held and to hold them accountable. And if it's going to result in suicides, that is unfortunate, but it is something that needs to be pointed out. When we think about addiction, there's this famous experiment called Rat Park that I'm sure many people have heard about. That rats were put in a cage and there was a wheel that they had to turn, and there was water that had been treated with opiates. And it was seen that the rats would quickly become addicted. They would take more water than they needed biologically. So then they did another cage with lots of amusement, lots of things that the rats could do to keep busy. And they had the same wheel delivering the treated water, and the rats did not become addicted. So again, this addiction is a symptom of malfunction. If things were well, people would not be addicted, because addiction is self-medication. It is an addiction like alcohol and all those things. So we have to hold these people accountable. I haven't seen a demonstration since as big as the Wall Street demonstration for a while. Have we had one? Mariana, you would know. We are getting lax. I think that the internet is a culprit, although it is very convenient. I think we have to be careful about the internet. It's also another opiate. We have to be careful about what is being delivered to us on the internet, because what we see, these narratives that come to us from the internet, are becoming global. I mean, anything on a TikTok message can be made in Zimbabwe and have gone around the world within minutes. And so that is becoming the narrative. And these are not narratives made by people who understand the problems that need to be solved. And so I really do think that it is up to us to expand our awareness. And we can begin locally by holding people to account locally.
Okay, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Bien. Gracias a todos. Hay una...
Thank you all. There will be book signing by all of the authors that have joined us. Have a good afternoon.